Hi everyone, I'm Ali. This is Radical Reads. I am reading part two of Mariam Kaba's We Do This Till We Free Us. So let me find a comfortable. I should have done this before starting to record, but I just realized I wasn't super. There we go. Alright, let's start. Part two. There are no perfect victims. Free Marissa and all black people. In these times, November 2014. What if she goes to jail again? How will you feel? The questions bring me up short. My goddaughter hasn't previously expressed an interest in Marissa Alexander. She knows that I've been involved in local defense committee to support Marissa in her struggle for freedom, but up to this point she hasn't asked any questions. Her mother, however, tells me that Nina, not her real name, has been following my updates on social media. Still considering how to respond, and I must have been silent for too long because Nina apologizes. Forget about it, Auntie. She says, I didn't mean to upset you. It's interesting that she thinks that I am upset. She knows that I have no faith in the US criminal legal system and perhaps assumes that I am pessimistic about Marissa's prospects in court. I tell her that while I have no faith in the criminal punishment system, I am hopeful for a legal victory in Marissa's case. I say that while the system as a whole is unjust, in some individual cases, legal victories can be. I tell her that this is particularly true for defendants who have good legal representation and resources. Money makes a difference in securing legal victories. I explain that this is why I have worked so hard to fundraise for Marissa's legal defense. But how will you feel if she's convicted again, though? Nina persists. I'll definitely be sad for her and her family, I respond. I think that you'll be a lot more than sad, she says. Does sadness have levels? I guess so. I'm not sure what more than sad feels like, so I keep quiet. A friend who has spent years supporting Marissa Alexander through the Free Marissa Now national mobilization campaign recently confided that she was unable to contemplate another conviction for Marissa at her retrial in December. Many of us who have been supporting Marissa have been bracing ourselves, each of us trying to cope as best as we can. Over the past few weeks, I'd taken to asking comrades if they believed that Marissa would be free. Some answered affirmatively, without hesitation, but they were in the minority. Most eyed me warily and slowly said that they were hopeful of an acquittal. I don't think that they believed what they were saying. The U.S. criminal punishment system cannot deliver any justice. Marissa has already served over 1,000 days in jail and prison. She spent another year under strict house arrest wearing an ankle monitor, costing her family $105 every 2 weeks. Marissa fired a warning shot to ward off her abusive husband and no one was injured. For this, she was facing a 60-year sentence if convicted in her retrial. True justice is not being arrested and taken away from her family, children, and friends. Justice is living a life free of domestic abuse. Justice is benefiting from the state protection rather than suffering from state violence. Justice is having a self to defend in the first place. Yesterday morning, I got news that Marissa had agreed to a plea deal. A couple of hours later, the news broke on social media. I saw a mix of people celebrating this outcome and others expressing their anger that Marissa was forced into a Faustian choice. I got calls, texts, and emails from friends and family checking in on me. I appreciated everyone's concern, but I was unfortunately thrust into action when I heard that this grand jury in St. Louis would be announcing their indictment decision in the killing of Mike Brown later that day. It was a mad rush to make arrangements to combine solidarity events since we already had planned for Marissa's yesterday. In parallels between Marissa's unjust prosecution and imprisonment of Mike Brown's killing by law enforcement are evident to me. Yet I am well aware that for too many these are treated as distinct and separate occurrences. They are not. In fact, the logic of anti-blackness and punishment connects both. In the late 19th century, a remark was attributed to a Southern police chief who suggested that there were three types of homicides. If an N kills a white man, that's murder. If a white man kills a black man, that's justifiable homicide. Black man kills a black man, that's one less black man. Ugh. The devaluing of black life in this country has its root in colonial America. In the book Popular Justice, A History of Lynching in America, Manfred Berg makes a convincing case that the slave codes singled out blacks for extremely cruel punishment, thus marking black bodies as innately inferior. Berg argues colonial slavery set clear patterns for future racial violence in America. Innate inferiority bodies can be debased, punished, and killed without consequences. The twist is the black people have always been considered dangerous along with our disposability. Mike Brown's disposable body is a lethal weapon and so is justifiably threatening. Marissa's disposable body is deserving of abuse and incapable of claiming a self worth defending. Mike Brown was described by his killer, Darren Wilson, as a demon and called an it. The doctrine of preemptive killing and preventative captivity finds expression in its daily lives of all black people in the United States. Black people are never innocent. That language of concept doesn't apply to them. We're always guilty until proven something less than suspect or dangerous. Marissa and Mike are inextricably linked. They can only be seen as the aggressors and are never victims. Mike is painted as a super subhuman, and Marissa is described as not seeming fearful. Black skin is a repellent to empathy, which makes it difficult to seek redress in courts of law and public opinion. If we can't generate empathy in others, then the humanity that is denied to us is always out of reach. So we combine our solidarity actions for Marissa and for Mike yesterday because we take it as a fact that all #Black Lives Matter. Charlene Carruthers of BYP 100 made this clear as she lifted up the name of Island Nettles alongside those of Marissa and Mike. I'm not naive, though. I know that our response to the grand jury non-indictment of Darren Wilson unfortunately stands apart from some of the others. I thought about some lines from one of my favorite poems, Sister's Outsider by Opal Palmer Adisa yesterday. We women black are always outside, even when we believe. Marissa, Cece, Islan, Monica, Tanisha, and many others are too often outside of our discourse of our protest too. It's imperative that they be brought inside and centered. Marissa decided that she had had enough of living in the in-between, not behind the walls of the prison, yet not quite outside. She made a decision for herself and her family to accelerate the possibility that she can experience again the unfree freedom that all of us who live black in the United States have when we aren't formally caged. She should have been able to demand total freedom, but this must feel like Everest. So she took a plea that will ensure that she won't spend the rest of her natural life in a cage, as Alyssa Barrier of Free Marissa Now said yesterday. The deal will help Marissa and her family avoid yet another very expensive and emotionally exhausting trial that could have led to the devastating ruling of spending the rest of her life in prison. Marissa's children, family, and community need her to be free as soon as possible. However, the absurdity of Marissa's case was always the fact that the courts punished and criminalized her for surviving domestic violence, for saving her own life. The mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years and then 60 years just made the state's prosecution increasingly shocking. But we have always believed that forcing Marissa to serve even one day in prison represents a profound and systematic attack on Black women's rights to exist and all women's rights to self-defense. When I've been tabling or facilitating teach-ins about Marissa, people sometimes ask if I know her personally. I don't. I can read the questions on their faces. Why then are we talking about her case? Why are you committed to her freedom? I devoted so many hours to raising awareness and funds to Marissa's legal case because she is a human being who has been unjustly targeted and is still fighting to get free. I'm always on freedom's side. Marissa's unfreedom cages me. Who will keep our sisters if not us? If I hadn't helped my sister, they have put those chains on me. They tied her body to a tree and left her bleeding until we cut her down and took her home as a daughter. Niobe Saba, Song of Sisters' Freedom. Yesterday I stood in the freezing Chicago night with hundreds of other people to show our solidarity with Marissa. In our own way, we were cutting her down from the tree to take her home as a sister, till Marissa is free. Not a cardboard cutout. Cyntoia Brown and the Framing of a Victim. With Britt Schult, The Appeal, December 2017. The evening of August 6, 2004, 16-year-old Cyntoia Brown shot and killed Johnny Allen, a 43-year-old Nashville resident who picked her up for sex. It was an act of self-defense, she explained to the police later. After Allen took her to his house, he showed Cyntoia multiple guns, including shotguns and rifles. Later in bed, as she described in court, he grabbed her violently by the genitals. His demeanor became threatening, and fearing for her life, she took a gun out of her purse and shot him. Though Cyntoia acted to protect herself from the violence of an adult client, Nashville prosecutors argued that she shot Allen as part of a robbery. Cyntoia was tried as an adult and was convicted of first-degree premeditated murder, first-degree felony murder, and especially aggravated robbery, 2 years after her initial arrest on August 25, 2006. She is currently serving concurrent life sentences in Tennessee and will only be eligible for parole after serving 51 years in prison. In late November, Cyntoia's case roared into the headlines again when celebrities like Rihanna, Kim Kardashian, and LeBron James shared details of her conviction on social media. Rihanna posted on Instagram, "Did we somehow change the definition of #justice along the way? Something is horribly wrong when the system enables these rapists and victims is thrown away for life. To each of you responsible for this child sentence, I hope to God you don't have children because this could be your daughter being punished for punishing already." Kim Kardashian shared on Twitter that she had reached out to her personal attorneys to ask about how to free Cyntoia Brown. It's unclear why Cyntoia's case has reemerged to capture the public's imagination 13 years after her arrest. Charles Bone, one of the Cyntoia's lawyers, told BuzzFeed that he didn't know why celebrities were now discovering Cyntoia's case, but that he is welcome to the attention. This issue in general is worthy of a lot of publicity, Bone said, especially in the culture in which we live today. As petitions calling for Cyntoia's release and the letters demanding clemency circulate online, it's worth considering the issues raised by Cyntoia's conviction and the renewed push to free her from prison. Here's what has been established about her case in the court record. Cyntoia, who at the time of the indictment was living in a room at Nashville In-Town Suites, said she went home with Allen because her pimp and boyfriend Garion McLaughlin, nicknamed Cutthroat, insisted that she needed to earn money. Cutthroat abused her physically and sexually throughout the approximately 3-week period in which she lived with him. Cyntoia herself was able to talk about the night of her attack and Allen's death in the 2011 PBS documentary Me Facing Life, Cyntoia's Story. Centoya explained that she was looking to get a ride to East Nashville to engage in street-based sex work when she met Helen, who was scoring a Sonic drive-in parking lot for sex workers. Helen propositioned her and attempted to haggle her down from $200 to $100, and they finally agreed upon $150. Centoya characterized her survival strategies as survival sex work or teenage prostitution for an adult pimp. While she says that she was coerced into sex work by Cutthroat, Centoya never described herself as a child sex slave, a term that is now being used to characterize her experience by some advocates on social media. Such sensationalist language is reductionist and obscures her complexities inherent in the experience of young people in the sex trade and street economies. It is more helpful to turn young women into sex trade themselves for a better understanding of the term they use to describe their own experience. Kira Hassan has worked with girls involved in sex trade and street economies as the former co-director of the now defunct Chicago-based Young Women's Empowerment Project. She defines the sex trade as any way that girls are trading sex or sexuality or forced to trade sex or sexuality for anything like money, gifts, survival needs, documentation, places to stay, and drugs. Survival sex and involvement in sex trade are often the only means for young people to provide themselves when they leave home. This is especially true for youth of color and queer and trans youth, who have less access to resources and opportunities. The realities faced by most teenagers engaged in survival sex are shaped by unsafe homes and housing, lack of access to employment, affordable housing, healthcare including gender-affirming healthcare, mental health resources, and by poverty, racism, queerphobia, and misogyny. The street economy, Hassan explained, encompasses anything that you do for cash that's not taxed. Whether that's hair braiding, whether that's selling CDs on the corner, something that you're going to do that's going to get you money that isn't reportable. Both of these methods are ways that girls have found to survive when they're street-based. Trafficking, on the other hand, refers to any form of labor, including, but not limited to, sexual labor, by force, fraud, or coercion. It's true that there are young people who are trafficked and who experience extraordinary violence in the sex trade, but it's important not to assume that every young person who trades sex for money is trafficked. Even if the law defines everyone under the age of 18 who trades sex as trafficked, regardless of their actual experience. Doing so ignores the complexity of their experiences and does a disservice to them by denying them any agency or self-determination, including to define their own experiences and demand their own solutions. Their lives should not be flattened into a service of perfect victim. Centoya is not a cardboard cutout upon whom other adults can project their narratives of youth involvement in sex trades. She's a young woman who has experienced horrible violence, but that is not all she is. She has her own story to tell, but by portraying her as a victim without agency, some of Centoya's advocates make it more difficult for her story of self-defense, her fight to survive, and her resistance to violence to be respected. We need to find a way to describe all of her realities, both as a survivor of violence with the right to defend herself and as a young woman who was doing her best to survive. Will this renewed focus on Centoya serve to improve the lives of all young people in the sex trade and street economies? Or will the current attention in the framing of her as a victim of sex slavery or trafficking serve to further marginalize them by silencing their voices and complexities in service of pursuing a perfect victim narrative, one that Black women are routinely excluded from? The consequences of young women who don't fit the perfect victim narrative are significant, both in terms of being harshly punished for self-defense and being framed as traffickers themselves and then threatened with long sentences under new laws ostensibly passed by their own protection. Even if not subjected to punishment by what we call the criminal legal system, because we believe there is no justice in this system, any of the new trafficking laws passed at a state level over the past decade may force them back into foster care and other systems they have fled because of the harm they experience. Or these laws may coerce them into treatment that does nothing to address the conditions under which they enforce the sex trade in the first place. If they don't comply with what is expected of them as perfect victims, then they, like many other survivors of violence, may find themselves caged in a cell instead of receiving the support they need and deserve. Prosecuting and incarcerating survivors of violence puts courts and prisons in the same punitive role as their abusers, which compounds and prolongs victims' experience of ongoing trauma and abuse. The push to keep Cyntoia as a child is also troubling. Since the recent surge of interest in her case, graphic artists have created images of Brown with pigtails she donned during her trial when she was 16, accompanied by the text Free Cyntoia. Another image of her at the similar age has been appropriated into a meme juxtaposed with the rapist Brock Turner's mugshot, using her incorrect age and unconfirmed case circumstances. Other memes have claimed a pedophile sex trafficking ring was responsible for the violence visited upon Cyntoia. Why are these images and memes being circulated? Is an adult 29-year-old black woman an unsympathetic victim? If so, why? Acknowledging trauma and resilience are often ignored in favor in the driving desire by the media and public to support only a perfect victim. Perfect victims are submissive, not aggressive. They don't have histories of drug use or prior contact with criminal legal system, and they are innocent and respectable. The reality, however, is that there is no perfect victim. 29-year-old Cyntoia deserves to be free from prison and absolved of this crime, no less than 16-year-old young Cyntoia should have been. Cyntoia's story, while tragic and unfair, is not exceptional. As we were writing this piece, Alicia Walker, another criminalized survivor, called us from Decatur Correctional Center, an Illinois prison where she has been incarcerated since March of this year, and unless she is freed, will have to spend another 10 years. She's an amazing woman, so brave, Alicia said of Cyntoia's case. Shit, she was 16? No one should be punished for enduring harms themselves. That girl was just doing what she had to do. Alicia Walker, who was 19 years old when, in 2014, she was forced to defend herself and a friend from a violent client who demanded that they have unprotected sex with him and threatened them with rape and a knife. Alicia, like Cyntoia before her and so many before them, fought back. Her act of self-defense was met with violence as a racist court system that branded her as a manipulative criminal mastermind. Alicia and Cyntoia were both young black women. Bodies were inscribed with the inherent criminality and were, to some degree, presumed guilty until proven innocent. The judicial system, as currently constituted, would and could not have allowed them to be seen as innocent. Instead, Cyntoia's and Alicia's radical acts of self-love and preservation were criminalized by those with authority. Each had the carceral weight of the racism and whorephobia stacked against them. Courts historically mete out punishment disproportionate to the acts of self-defense by black women, femmes, and trans people. This criminalization of self-defense predates Cyntoia. We see this in the case of survivors Lena Baker, Jessie Woods, and Rosa Lee Ingram, for example. It has continued long after Cyntoia's sentencing 13 years ago. We see the same disproportionate punishment in more recent cases of Gigi Thomas, Cece McDonald, and Kai Peterson. And these are just the names and stories that we know. There are many others that never grab headlines or inspire social media or grassroots defense campaigns. Let's hashtag free Cyntoia Brown, not only from the cage she has unjustly been held in for the past 13 years for fighting for her life, but also from the narratives that take away her agency, police, and control what it means to be a survivor of violence. And let's do the same for all young people in the sex trade and all survivors of violence. In the words of Young Women's Empowerment Project, social justice for girls and young women in the sex trade means having the power to make all of these decisions about our own bodies and lives without policing, punishment, or violence. We are not the problem, we are the solution. Young Women's Empowerment Project, girls do what they have to do to survive, eliminating methods used by girls in the sex trade and street economy to fight back and heal, from 2009. From Me Too to All of Us, Organizing to End Sexual Violence Without Prisons. Interview by Sarah Jaffe and Mariam Kaba and Shira Hassan in These Times, January 2017. I think. Sarah Jaffe. Sexual harassment and sexual assault are in the news because of powerful, famous men. I wanted to start off with the question for both of you who have been doing this work for a while. Do you feel like the public conversation around these people in the media, on social media, or wherever you're hearing it has progressed at all? Does it look different right now from when you began doing this work? Mariam Kaba. The conversation is absolutely different from when I started doing work around sexual assault. I began doing anti-sexual assault work on my college campus. That was in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The focus at that point was on the question of date rape on campus, and the conversations revolved mostly around people drinking and then assaulting people. I also came of age before social media. The conversation was very much limited to having talks with your friends. It wasn't this kind of generalized conversation that is not even really a conversation, which is more often a one-way harangue, a one-way rant, or just venting. It really wasn't like that. You had to talk to people you knew. Beyond that, we were talking with folks in support group settings, storytelling and divulging that you had been raped. It wasn't an environment of compulsory confession where we were forced into disclosing that you were a survivor of sexual violence. It didn't feel like we had to premise our conversations on disclosing our experiences before we could actually speak to this in real ways. I, yes, indeed, am a survivor of sexual assault and violence, but it just felt different at the time. It felt somehow more intimate and less tied to media and social media. I don't know where the movie The Accused came out, when the movie The Accused came out. I often see that movie in my trajectory of coming into my own and understanding sexual violence. That movie felt like a moment that made sexual violence connect much more with the larger media conversation, but maybe I'm remembering that. Shira Hassan. I totally remember when that movie came out, and it really did change the conversation. Bless Jodie Foster. I think the conversation has definitely changed. We've had the conversation much more publicly. It's a lot different from writing people's names on the bathroom walls, which is what we were doing in the 1990s. Facebook has become the bathroom wall in a way. I think the way we have conversation changes. Then I think because it is a much more democratized platform to some degree, different people are in the conversation than used to be. I do think that by the large, the people who are having the conversations are still the same though. I don't see this conversation happening in the same way about young people in the sex trade, for example. A lot of the young people I know are a lot of the young people I know are more street based. The idea of sexual harassment is something that people are thinking about and angry about. Gwyneth Paltrow is not commenting on their experiences. She's commenting on the actresses in Hollywood. I don't want to diminish or demean how important these experiences of violence are. At the same time, it is a certain kind of survivor and a certain kind of violence that we are talking about. I think that part is the same. Jeff. One of the things about this big public conversation is that, for me, it actually feels more overwhelming. What Mariam called this culture of compulsory confession feels smothering. It just feels like there is nothing we can do. You have been doing work around this for a while and dealing directly with survivors. How do you fight that feeling that this is never going to end? Hassan. There are stories that overwhelm me and stop me in my tracks, but there are also stories of people I love, and there is a face to the story most of the time for me. The feeling of being overwhelmed is something that I counter with action and I counter with healing. This idea of healing justice, where speaking out is a part of the healing, I feel connected to that as an action, not so much connected to that as a burden. I feel like it is a blessing to be among survivor stories. I don't actually feel overwhelmed by survivor stories. I feel overwhelmed by inaction around the survivor stories. Kava. For me, it is the difference between the question of asking what I can personally do versus what we can do. When I think of what I can do as an individual person, it feels much more overwhelming. It is like, well, a lot of my friends are survivors, a lot of people I care for and love are survivors. I can't personally take responsibility for all of their lives and their pain. I can't take all of that on. You can't also just take on everybody's joy either. When I think about it in that kind of individualistic way, it can feel overwhelming. But I have worked towards a collective idea of healing and a collective idea of action and organizing. I don't think that this is the issue we have right now. I don't think that the issue we have right now is that we have too many organizers. I think we have too few organizers, and that can also feel super debilitating when there's a lot of hand wringing or a lot of outrage, but without any direction. I think that we can feel overwhelming. I think that I think that can feel overwhelming. Since 1988, since I have been on in this field, what has kept me going is the collectivity and seeking to actually understand and to heal and to be a part of what healing process with other people. Joff. We end up with this story of one survivor who has to come forward and file charges with the police, and then this one perpetrator will be held accountable. But that doesn't work. Kaba. And it doesn't happen. I think that this is another aspect of this for people who are counting on a criminal punishment response to this. I understand feeling completely depressed and debilitated because the system doesn't actually know how to hold firm for survivors. It doesn't know how to transform harm that occurs. It is a system that most people don't access, and most survivors still never access for a lot of reasons, because they don't want to, because they have been traumatized in the past by the system, because they don't want the person who harmed them necessarily caught up in the system. There are a million reasons, because they don't want to be raked over the coals themselves, because they try to solve problems in community. When people do access to the system, they are screwed over by it, literally in all different kinds of ways. Hassan. Not only can't the system do it, but I think our belief that it can is a part of why we feel so betrayed. Some of us have to let go of that betrayal because we have just stopped trying to get water from a stone. Frankly, the stone is being thrown at us. So we're now trying to build shelter from that stone and talk to everyone who is coming inside the shelter about what we can do. That for me is perhaps why I feel less overwhelmed. It isn't that I don't feel like, wow, we have an unbelievable amount to do, because I do feel like that a lot. But I do feel like we have so many more things to try away from the system than with it. What we have begun to create in this shelter together, we were where we really can focus on who is inside this huddle and work with each person who is there in a more meaningful way to move forward. Joff. In the wake of Weinstein's revelations, one of the things that some people have been talking about is the Whisper Network. This is the way that women warn each other about certain men in their political circles or in their work circles. Yet these feel inadequate too. They are not particularly accountable for the people making accusations, which is less of a problem than the fact that they just end up assuming that it is still our job to avoid perpetrators. Kaba. You can't force somebody into being accountable for things they do. That is not possible. People have to take accountability for things that they actually do wrong. They have to decide that this is wrong. They have to say, this is wrong and I want to be a part of making some sort of amends or repairing this or not doing it again. The question is, what in our culture allows people to do that? What are the structural things that exist? What in our culture encourages people who assault people and harm people to take responsibility? What I see is almost nothing. That means, for example, people continue to be rewarded when they do bad things to other people or may take negative action against people. We're in a situation where people try to argue over semantics. We don't have a sense that people are prepared to say there is a spectrum of sexual harm, not everything is rape, yet everything that feels like a violation is harm. We just don't have that within the larger culture that allows for people to feel like they can take responsibility and that they can be accountable. The other thing is that we do have the threat that if you do admit that you do this, you might be caught up in the criminal punishment system. You might see the inside of a jail, so your inclination is to deny until the very end. There's just no incentive for you to come clean and be like, I actually did this. Yes, I did rape this person. I did sexually assault them. I did harass them. I did molest them. We're in the adversarial model where you don't admit it, and the person who is actually being placed on trial is the survivor to prove that you actually did this. So I understand within that why people feel like they have to whisper and why survivors then have to take on the weight of actually figuring out how to bring somebody to accountability. The incentive structure is set up this stuff. And of course, not all survivors are women. Kaba, exactly. This is, to me, the work that we have to do. We have to make community members understand that sexual harm looks like, what it feels like, why it is unacceptable. We have to make violence unthinkable in our culture. We have to make interpersonal violence unthinkable. We have to that is the place that we have to work from if we're really going to transform this into something where isn't the survivors or the victims who have to carry the load of the time. Hassan. I want to add one thing. The history of where those lists come from. Those kinds of lists got started with people in the sex trade, and particularly transgender women of color, who started creating bad date sheets. These were informal sheets, literally, that were written down and passed around through the community. We used to photocopy them, copy them down, and hand them out with people's physical descriptions. The rest of the world looks at people in the sex trade as completely disposable, but we borrow their tools all the time when we feel disposable. I want to be sure that we recognize the history and legacy of the tools that are being used, how they are being used, and why they are being used before we say that they are not working or important. Because the next thing just has to grow out of that. What is the next thing we're going to do with all those lists? We went from the bathroom wall to Facebook. We went from photocopying the sheet with descriptions to passing it around online. We do have the power and capacity to think of what's next, but we haven't quite yet. In part, it's because we don't have solidarity with each other and we don't recognize that the spectrum of sexual violence is something that is happening to all of us. We live in rape culture, and all of this is going to keep happening to us until we collectively figure out what we are doing here. Kaba. As Shira mentioned early on, who are the survivors we are actually uplifting? Who are the people? What is the sexual violence? When we put people in prisons and in jails, often we are sentencing them to judicial rape because we are sentencing them to judicial rape because we know they are going to be assaulted when they go inside. Yet we are still putting people in that environment to be assaulted. How are you going to be anti-rape advocate or organizer and still be pressing for people to be put into rape factories? We have to complicate this conversation around sexual violence and see all the different ways that is used as a form of social control across the board, with many different people from all different genders, all different races, and all different social locations. If we understand the problem in that way, we have a better shot at actually uprooting all of the conditions that led to this and addressing all of the ways in which sexual violence reinforces other forms of violence. Our work over a couple of decades has now been devoted to complicating narratives that are too easy. These really simple narratives around perfect victims who are assaulted by evil monsters, and that is the end of the story. The kill all rapists conversation, which just kind of flattens what sexual violence really is, that doesn't take into consideration the spectrum of sexual violence, minimizes certain people's experiences, and make other people's experiences more valid. I want to press my concern about the perfect victim narrative, but also challenge the assumption that we all have this same experience because we have been raped, and we all think that the same way about how to address it, and that for all of us being a rape survivor becomes your identity. We were raped. Something bad happened to us. We were trying to address that, but we're not taking on the survivor as a total, uh, total, totalizing identity for everyone we do in our lives that matter. I want more of those kinds of conversations to be happening in public, but somehow we can't have those. We can't have complicated conversations about sexual violence because then you are accused of rape apology, or you are accused of coddling rapists. This is very, very limiting. It means that we're not going to be able to uproot and really solve the problems ultimately. Hassan. I don't know what is going to happen with Mr. Weinstein, but I know that he has enough money to make what he wants to happen a possibility. The consequences that are going to happen to him, they may never measure up to the harm that he created. Yet we see a wide-scale harm happening for people who may ultimately want to be accountable. Sexual violence is very nuanced, and the system that we have is not. Prison is not feminist. That is one of Mariam's famous points. Prison isn't feminist because it recreates the same sexual violence and the same fear, the same kinds of oppression. It is the pin on the head of the racist and the sexist system that we live in. That does not mean, however, there should be no consequences. It means real consequences. Consequences that really matter. It means transforming the conditions that exist in the first place for this even have happened. It is really critical for people to think about the difference between punishment and consequences. Punishment often is actually not the same as transformation. Even though it feels good to wear the Kill All Rapists t-shirt, that isn't the thing that is actually going to get us the world we want to live in. Kaba. I also want to talk a little bit about what is hopeful about what is happening in the world around these issues. Kira and I just spent 3.5 days in Chicago with 50 people from around the country doing trainings and facilitating discussions and dialogues about how we do community accountability to address sexual harm and interpersonal violence. These folks came together from all around the country and took that much time out of their day because we understood that this as a moment of opportunity for something different. A lot of people are talking now, and there is much more awareness around the fact that the prison industrial complex has churned communities and people through a meat grinder, devastating people. Yet people don't feel safer. People don't feel as though violence is curbed in any way. We have to build up the skills of being able to ask questions like, what does it mean to actually center a survivor who is harmed? What does it mean to actually support people who have caused harm? What does it mean to take responsibility for saying, we refuse in our community to condone when this happens? One of the things that is important is that harm causes wounds that necessitate healing. That is what so many people are looking for, a way to begin to heal. How are we going to create in our communities spaces that allow people real opportunity to heal? Again, this will not necessarily be accomplished through compulsory confession in a public way. But how do we hold that people who have been harmed deserve an opportunity for the harm to be addressed in a real way? Often that is all people want, a real acknowledgement that I was hurt. Somebody did it. I want them to know that they did it. And I want to see that they have some remorse for having done it. And I want them to start a process by which they will ensure to themselves at least and be accountable to their community for not doing it again. That is what I'm trying to get as a survivor. I think there's hope in that. Black women punished for self-defense must be freed from their cages. The Guardian, January 2019. On June 23, 1855, after enduring 5 years of sexual violence, Celia, a 19-year-old Missouri enslaved woman, killed her master, Robert Newsom. Newsom was a 60-year-old widower who had purchased Celia when she was 14. On the day of her purchase, he raped her on the way to his farm. Sexual control of enslaved women by white owners was critical to the perpetuation of slavery, and these owners relied on routine sexual abuse as much as they did other forms of brutality. By the time she killed Newsom, Celia had already had 2 of his children and was pregnant with a third. She had started a relationship with one of the Newsom's male slaves, George, who insisted that she end her sexual relationship with Newsom if they were going to continue theirs. Celia approached Newsom's daughters and implored them to ask their father to end the sexual assaults. But no one could protect her, so she confronted Newsom herself when he came to force yet another unwanted sexual encounter. She clubbed him to death, then burned his body at the fireplace. Her court-appointed lawyer suggested that a Missouri law permitting a woman to use deadly force to defend herself against sexual advances be extended to enslaved as well as free women. Despite their vigorous defense, the court disagreed, found that Celia was a property, not a person. But while Celia was not considered a person under the law and could therefore not be raped, she did not have enough agency to be judged as a murderess and punished for her act of resistance. She was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. After an appeal of the case failed, Celia was hanged on December 21st, 1855. Black women have always been vulnerable to violence in this country and have long been judged as having no self-defend, a term I devised and named an anthology on the subject after. When Ida B. Wells began her anti-lynching and anti-rape campaigns a few decades after Celia was hanged in the late 19th century, she was determined to expose the myths that black men were rapists and that black women could not be raped. Wells insisted that black women entitled to state protection and the recourse of self-defense as a right of citizenship. In 2018, this right still proves elusive. What has changed since Celia's time? Asked Marissa Alexander. In late January 2017, Alexander was freed from the shackles of her ankle monitor after 2 years of house arrest and 3 years of incarceration. Her freedom was secured through good lawyering and a national participatory legal defense organizing campaign. Alexander's torturous journey through the criminal punishment system began in 2010 when she was confronted by her estranged husband in her home after having just given birth to her third child, a little girl, 9 days earlier. Alexander used a gun that she was licensed to own and fired a single warning shot into the air to ward off her abusive husband, who admittedly, in a subsequent deposition, to having abused every woman he had been partnered with except for one. For this, a jury found her guilty of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, followed by a 12-minute deliberation. It was that deadly weapon charge that prosecutors used to recommend that Marissa be sentenced under Florida's 10-20 life law to a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years. The judge, who had previously ruled that Marissa was ineligible to invoke the stand your ground defense because she didn't appear afraid, said that his hands were tied by the law and ratified the 20-year sentence. While self-defense laws are interpreted generously when applied to white men who feel threatened by men of color, they are applied very narrowly to women and gender nonconforming people, and are particularly women and gender nonconforming people of color trying to protect themselves in domestic violence and sexual assault cases. Black women have been excluded from definitions of respectable or proper womanhood, sexuality, and influencing how their right to bodily autonomy and agency. In 2017, there were 219,000 women in U.S. prisons and jails, most of them poor and of color. In 2014, according to the Sentencing Project, Black non-Hispanic females had an imprisonment rate over twice that of white non-Hispanic females. Sociologist Beth Ritchie has suggested that a key to responding to women in conflict with the law is understanding their status as crime victims. Multiple studies indicate that between 71% and 95% of incarcerated women have experienced physical violence from an inmate partner. In addition, many have experienced multiple forms of physical and sexual abuse in childhood and as adults. This reality has been termed the abuse to prison pipeline. These numbers are high because survivors have systematically punished for those taking actions to protect themselves and their children while living in unstable and dangerous conditions. Survivors are criminalized for self-defense, failing to control abusers' violence, migration, removing their children from situations of abuse, being coerced into criminalized activity, and securing resources needed to live day to day while suffering economic abuse. 3 years ago, I co-founded an organization called Survived and Punished. Our work focuses on freeing criminalized survivors of gender-based violence. Too many women and gender non-conforming people are in prison for defending themselves against their abusers, and we're demanding that Governors Jerry Brown and Andrew Cuomo use their clemency powers to free these survivors from their cages. As Dr. Elisa Vieira, a co-founder of S&P, suggests, our political strategies must recognize that racialized gender violence and state violence are not isolated or oppositional, but integral to each other. We are determined to ensure that more people understand those connections. On December 6th, the Tennessee Supreme Court issued its decision stating that Cyntoia Brown, who was sentenced to life in prison at the age of 16 for killing a man in self-defense who had picked her up for sex, must serve at least 51 years before becoming eligible for parole. People across the U.S. were once again outraged as her case returned to the public attention, and some have moved to demand that the governor, Bill Haslam, commute her sentence before he leaves office in January 19, 2019. The governor is said to be considering clemency in her case, which is unfortunately not an exceptional. There are thousands of Cyntoia Browns unjustly locked in cages in every state. We have to address the systematic and cultural issues that contribute to the criminalization of survival as we work to free Cyntoia Brown and all the others currently behind bars. 165 years ago, Celia was killed for defending her bodily autonomy. Cyntoia Brown shouldn't have died in prison for doing the same. After years of resistance from Cyntoia Brown and from organizations, activists, and celebrities demanding her release on January 7, 2019, the Tennessee governor did indeed grant her full clemency. Cyntoia Brown Long wrote and published her autobiography in late 2019, The Free Cyntoia, My Search for Redemption in the American Prison System, by Cyntoia Brown Long and Bethany Marger. And that is part 2. I'll start part 3 in a couple of weeks. Yeah, thanks for listening to this important but definitely hard subject.